Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Represent the queermusicals.com podcast. I'm here with the wonderful Joshua Castille. Josh, do you want to introduce yourself a bit, say what you do, all of those sorts of wonderful things?
Uh, Hello, thanks for having me back. It's lovely to see you again. My name is Joshua Castille. I'm an artivist, activist, actor, artist. So I put that together into artivism. And I live in Chicago now, and I just create and do whatever my mind says to do. I don't know.
That's amazing. So I first got in touch with you quite a few years ago now when I first started
Yeah.
writing the book that I mention every episode of this podcast that still hasn't been written. But we had a conversation right at the very beginning. I know it's terrible, 5 years. Um,
Oh my
we
gosh.
we had a conversation right at the very beginning because I was looking at the representation of different queer characters, and I was
Mhm.
really drawn to your performance as Hanshin.
No,
Yes.
Ernst. Good, good, good.
Ernst,
That
the
close.
other
Yes,
one. Yes.
Ernst.
I was
Yes.
really drawn to your performance as Ernst in Spring Awakening. And we had a whole conversation about the idea of playing a queer character, but also playing a queer character in the Deaf West production specifically.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
I wonder if we might be able to kind of retread that a little bit and talk a little bit about that. I mean, it's ever such a long time ago now, isn't it? But
I know.
yeah, be
But
able
I
to
mean, like
talk.
a lot has changed since then. I mean, like we've had
Mm,
so much more queer representation, and now we have
yeah.
cats off
Oh,
Broadway,
yes.
which my friends have been going to see, and my friends are very critical, and they've all been like, "It is phenomenal, it is lovely, it is great." And so, like, I feel like we've jumped so
Yeah.
much from like it's been a few years, but not enough to be like, "Oh, way back in the day," like it's been like
Mm,
a couple of years, and so much has changed. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So
Spring Awakening
yes.
was great. That's what we talked
Mm,
about before. It was lovely to play Ernst, who was a gay guy who didn't know that he was gay until later in the play.
mm.
Um, I was not that. I knew I was gay when I was 8, and I was like, we're gonna talk about it.
I love that so much.
Yeah, right. I'm sure my family loved that too. I'm sure they were like, yeah, this is great. This is great. Yeah. He's deaf and gay. Oh, great. A sinner. We love him.
Oh, one of the things that really stood out that you said last time actually is when you talked about how having those two experiences made you very different to your
Mhm.
parents and how that kind of affected you. And I guess that's something that comes out a little bit in Spring Awakening as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Uh, Being deaf, I mean, most of us aren't born to deaf parents, so like,
mm.
and most of our parents have never met a deaf person before. And so I remember when I was little, I used to be like, I would argue with my mother, and she goes, "I don't know, I've never had a deaf child before. This is my first time." And I go back to that a lot because now I'm like, I'm 29, and she was 17 when she had me. So I was probably like
Gosh.
arguing with her when she was like 28. So I'm like,
Mm.
at this age, I'm just like, I don't know. I've never had a baby. Like, I'm 29. Shut up. And I love that. I think about that a lot. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I think that, and then you have the gay thing where it's like, for some reason, my family, it's funny now we're recapping, well, not recapping, but coming back to the conversation because I was like, my parents now have gotten into a different space now with
Mm.
the gay thing. Like my grandfather touched my current partner, and he didn't even acknowledge my previous partner. And so like there's like a transition happening.
Yeah.
There's I don't know, and like so I think they're just like I think it's just the jarring. We don't know what this is, and so they just freeze. And then like
Mm.
over time, I just have to keep being like, "Hello," and I know, yeah.
That's really did you did a show that brought some of this up, didn't you? Did you do a one person show at some stage?
I did. Oh my gosh, I did. It was called Eggy, kind of. Yeah, it was called
Mm,
Eggy. It was a one-man show that I wrote and I performed twice. And then I was like, I'm gonna put this away for now. But it was
yeah.
about a kid who's falling in love with a boy. So it's a series of him reading a letter, and like the
Mm,
letter shows a progression of him and this guy that he's talking to, and then it's like this therapist who ends up putting him into conversion camp, and
mm.
like the whole it was very dark. And I think I put it away for a reason. I'm like, I don't, yeah.
Yeah.
They
I
kept
think that's
asking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that happens sometimes, doesn't it, for those of us that are sort of that are writers or improvisers or devisers. I think we sometimes there's a right time to talk about things, but then we also have to know the time where it's time to stop talking about that now. It's time to try and find a way to close it and to move on. And
Yeah.
it's one of the things I love about your work because I've followed your work for quite a while now, and I love that there's always different things that you're engaging with as you kind of grow as a person, I suppose, as well as you develop as a person. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of the things that this podcast is about is queer representation, but also queer representation across intersections as well. So for
Hmm.
some people, that's intersections with race or with disability, and it's been lovely to talk to you about the kind of intersections with deafness as well.
Yeah.
And again, one of the reasons why I think Spring Awakening was so important is
Hmm.
because there was a queer character and the queer character was deaf, and it brought across all these kind of things, like you say, that it's not there's more than one thing to a personality, isn't it? It's not just the gay
Right.
one or the deaf, which is usually what we're put in a box of. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's really lovely. I was going to ask you a little bit about. Oh, go on. Sorry, Josh. Go
Oh
on.
no, no, no. You're bringing ideas and thoughts that are inspiring ideas and thoughts to me, and I think that like it's I think I'm always fascinated with the idea that we can learn from other communities. And
Hmm.
so when like we were talking about like there's a right time to talk about this, there's a right time to talk about that. And when I performed that one man show in Spain, because there was a deaf association that was like, can you come and do something? Like
Hmm.
whatever you want to do. And I was like, I have this one man show. And I got there and I translated the whole show into Spanish. I had a person who like reviewed it and everything. And no one for the entire week told me this. I performed the show, and when it was done, they were like, "We outlawed conversion therapy like 30 years ago." And I was like, "We haven't in the United States, so it's still a relevant conversation
Yeah,
here."
absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's
Mhm.
funny that that was when I had my first moment of being like, really knowing your audience helps a lot
Hmm.
to be like, yeah, this is the conversation we're gonna have today. And I it also inspires the thought of recently I was talking with some of my Black friends who were bringing up the idea of like, I'm tired of doing slave plays. I'm tired of this
Hmm.
conversation of we're enslaved, we're enslaved, we're enslaved. I want to talk about Black joy. I want to talk about
Yeah.
queer joy. And I was like,
Hmm.
I always find myself learning from the Black civil rights movement, specifically African American, because I'm American. So like,
Hmm.
but that whole thing of like now it's like, how do we celebrate and document and discuss Black joy has made me now in the phase of like, I don't want to talk about deaf queer trauma. I want to talk about deaf queer joy. What does that look like? And it's
Hmm.
difficult. It is so difficult to
Hmm.
talk about it in a way that I feel is worth your time. Like worth like $45 to sit down and watch
Hmm.
queer deaf joy. Like, I don't know. What are
Oh
your thoughts
gosh,
on that?
it's definitely so worth it. It's so worth it. And one of the greatest joys I had during the pandemic was I came along to some of your online deaf improv work.
Oh my
And
God, you saw that. Yes.
yeah, I did. And I'm an improviser as well. That's my background really. And it was so lovely to be in a space. I mean, obviously I couldn't interpret the American Sign Language, but I could tell what the stories were, and I could share in the joy that you had in collaborating with each other. And it really inspired me to watch how you worked as a community and how your communication is slightly different to the way that we might communicate. And actually, there's similarities as well because we do a lot of non-verbal work in improv. That's really
Right.
important. And one of the things when I'm teaching, I'm always talking about is you have to set up the space before you start talking because it's so important. You can give so many offers without saying a word, um, and it was so beautiful. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we play those games as well. It's just I can learn from this, and I can maybe take some different things there. And so I think absolutely there's always room for us to learn from different
Each
communities and also,
other.
yeah, from each other, absolutely. And I think the other thing as well that I've learned is when there is an intersection, so we are different in the fact that that you are deaf and I'm hearing, but
Yeah.
um, we're both gay, and so there is there is something there that is the same and something there that is different, and
Hmm.
all sorts of other differences. I'm British, you're American, I'm a
Yeah,
lot older than you. All these things. There are things that we can that are differences, but there are things that are the same that help us to kind of find a common ground, and then to explore the things that are different from that.
yeah.
And actually, I'm getting to this now. Actually, the reason I wanted to do a podcast with you that's publicly available is because our conversation that we had about 5 years ago, which was just an interview, really, um, it's been so inspirational to me because you
Mm.
introduced me to the idea of deaf gain,
Right.
which is a theory from H. Dirksen Bauman and Joseph Murray from about 2014. And you explained it in such a clear way. And you asked the question, is there something similar for queer people? Is there such a thing as queer gain? And that's really what I've
Uh-huh.
been working on for the last 5 years. But it'd be great if you could kind of talk a little bit about deaf gain and how that kind of helps your thinking or how helps you to think about
Mhm.
deafness.
I want to say that I really appreciate that you're doing this, and I really appreciate. Like, I feel like lately I've just been so disheartened sometimes by the state of current affairs, and I
Mm,
don't think it pertains to any particular country. I think we're all just kind of
yes.
like, what is happening, and having
Yeah.
this like, right? We do connect with people in different countries. We do
Mm,
connect with people of different identities. So it's not just white, race. It's not just gender. It's not just. We do have things that connect us, and I love
mm,
that. And one of the things that I find is so interesting about intersectionality or the concept of this is that it brings that we have shared experiences and perspectives.
mm,
And that I think is where I'm at with that conversation about
yes.
deaf gain is like we have shared experiences and perspectives. So by connecting with your shared experience, we can both find that we both learn from this experience of being a improv artist or
Yeah.
a gay person or a deaf person. That experience, that way of navigating life teaches us skills and teaches us techniques and I'm trying to think of words, techniques and ways of moving around
Mm,
life that then contributes to the betterment of society. So one of the things we talk about in the deaf community is deaf gain, like being a deaf
mm,
person, because we don't hear, we see things visually. So that helps us go, how do we make things more visual? And so when we create a space that's more visual, then
mm,
people from other countries come in, they're like, oh, I understand what's going on. And so it's like, oh, there's this side of that. And so one of the things in the disability movement is like disability gain, which is the next step of
mm.
like, ramps don't just help people in wheelchairs, they help everybody. They help,
Yeah.
the guy bringing supplies up into the building. They help,
Mm,
the person who has bad knees. They help everybody, and so that gain is something that I
mm,
try to bring into conversation when we start talking about money or we start saying it's going to be expensive to bring in this artist or it's going to be expensive to do
mm,
this. I'm like, okay, it's expensive, but what are we getting in return? Because you're
mm,
paying for something. So let's list all the pros that we're getting. We're getting more access. We're getting more whatever it is. And I think that really starts to help us as, I own a business, other people who own businesses, it helps us to be like, we can justify this expense, we can justify this
mm,
effort, and knowing that it may not be an easy trade-off, but it
mm,
does come with other things that were unexpected consequences of access. So that's
mm.
my short answer. That
Yeah,
was
no, that's great. That's great. Because I think one of the things that really helped me when thinking about the idea of queer gain was the whole thing
hmm
about that there's different types of gain. So Bauman and Murray
hmm
talk about individual gain. So the gain to the individual for being deaf. There was
hmm
things like you said, seeing things more visually. I don't know whether these things are maybe a little bit stereotypical, but they
Oh,
talk about how deaf people are particularly good at any job that involves focus because and particularly an analysis, visual analysis, that kind of thing. And so that's
hmm
kind of almost that's a gain to them but also a gain to the wider community. And as well as
yeah.
individual gain, then there's community gain, the gain to the whole I guess it's the gain that you get from being a community of people who are similar. And like we said, your improv would be an
Yeah.
example of that, how how that different form of improv is helps your community to connect to each other, and
Oh,
how you
absolutely.
developed all these new ideas that make it work for people who have the same lived experience. And then there's the
Yes.
idea of gain outside the community, which is everyone's gain. And I think you
Yes.
talked about the idea of the huddle in sports. I think that's what
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
used
yeah.
before.
And rugby and football, you do the huddle. So we would huddle so the other team couldn't see what we were signing, which
Mm,
then became so popular when you watch the sport. People are
yeah.
doing it, and you're like, but why?
Mm,
It worked.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think all sorts of things to do that in improv specifically. I mean, I was reading about how the idea of the circle comes from African culture, but it's also really important from deaf culture as well, in the
Yeah.
terms of the fact that everyone has to be able to see each other's
Yes.
faces, and if you're not in a
Faces. Yeah.
circle, it can't happen. And so all of these things, I think, like you say, it benefits everyone, not just the
Mhm.
community that it's within.
Oh, yeah.
And I loved that so much. And obviously, I went away and
Yeah.
researched that, and thought about that a lot. And hopefully, like I said, managed to observe some of that from the performances that I've seen. I mean, I also absolutely love, which I'll link to. I love your performances
Yeah.
that you've done
Uh,
over, the last 5 to 10 years, which are
uh,
cabaret performances where you reinterpret songs in AS. I say not reinterpret. Well, it is, I suppose, in American Sign
yeah.
Language,
Yeah.
and it brings out completely different things about the
Yeah.
songs when you see you sign them because well, yeah, can you talk a little bit about what how ASL is such a different language? Because I think this is
Well,
something you talked about before.
that was the thing I was gonna comment on is when you were like, deaf gain to these things, and I think one of the things I want to bring to the conversation now is that like I think deaf gain brings to the acting process the lack of like a common knowledge about a topic then
Mm,
makes us question and re-examine everything. And so we did an opera with Deaf West called Fidelio, which is
mm,
Beethoven's opera, the
yeah.
last thing he wrote. And I remember the first day the director was like, it's an opera and we love opera and the opera. And he just kept saying opera over and over. And so I just raised my hand. I was like, what does opera mean to you? Because
Mm,
what it means to us, and I literally turned to my deaf peers and I said, what does it mean? And everyone, all of us collectively just opened our mouths and went, no, like that was all you see. And it's like, so we don't see the face. It's
mm,
everyone just frozen and their mouths moving really big, and that's it.
mm,
So we're like, we don't get it. Like, what is
yeah.
this? And he was like, that is a great question. And he sat quietly for about 5 minutes and he's like thinking, he's like, opera is the ultimate form of peak emotion, is freedom to
Mm,
express the emotion that you're experiencing in the moment. I was like, great, there we go. That's what. And so as we did the process at the end, he was like, I think it's really interesting because you have no idea what opera is and you don't
mm,
experience it the same way we do. It makes us reevaluate, why are we doing
yeah.
what we do? Why does this work? And so I think that is a gain to the whole process of the arts, is like
Mm,
being someone who's not involved. Now we get to question that. And I think that leads into what you were talking about with my songs and performances, is I try to lean into the part of myself that is different. And I try to like see it from a deaf perspective. I know I'm speaking to you and I'm using this just because my parents trained me to talk, but
mm,
there is the whole other Josh that exists when I'm around deaf people. And that Josh, I try to keep into my artistic space. And I try to
mm,
own my perspective as a deaf person and like how I navigate things when I'm alone. And so
yeah.
that helps me to really create interesting translations, and it helps with the given circumstance of acting is always different for each character because they have a
Mm,
different background, right? And like when we do that, it's like a point of view in improv. You have to have a point of view. So I try to keep that
mm,
point of view, but then infuse that. And it's such a hard concept to express because it's like abstract, but it's like trying to have my deaf perspective and another perspective of someone who's poor or whatever, and putting
mm,
them all together and exploring what that looks like, I think really changes things. And I think that's what they're doing with Cats, is they're taking a
yes.
queer ballroom experience and this like T.S. Eliot collection of
Mm.
poems and seeing what happens. And I love that. I love it.
I mean, I was very lucky because I was in New York last week, and I was able to see the Cat's Ballroom. It was something
Thoughts.
else. Yeah, it felt like Cats had been written for this moment. I'm not a big fan of
Yeah.
Cats as a musical, but when you put it in this
No.
context, then it suddenly becomes like a ballroom competition. Oh, it was just it's one of the best things I've ever seen, I think, and one of the most moving things I've ever seen,
Oh my
because
gosh.
yeah, because it's a whole different language. And again, it's from coming from somebody who is, outside of Black queer culture.
Hmm.
So I have the link in from the queerness, but it's a completely different culture to the queer culture that I was brought up in. And, seeing people Vogue and the costumes um and the community that was within it, it was something really, really special. And I
Wow.
hope more people get to experience it as well, because there is something nice about it being, well off Broadway and in a space that really suits it. And only being on for a limited season. But there's also part of me that thinks, gosh, I want everyone to be able to experience this because
Right.
it's so, so important. And I feel the same about, Deaf West as well, and specifically Spring Awakening because it's an intersection with queerness. But I feel like that with all sorts of things. I think I said this when I spoke to you before, at the very beginning, before I started this project. I remember being in New York when Spring Awakening was on, and I looked at it, and Deaf West Spring Awakening, I thought, oh, that's not for me. That's for deaf people. I shouldn't,
Right.
go and see that. And that is probably one of my biggest regrets, because I could have experienced that in the room. I could have been there rather than watching,
A
a
bootleg.
a bootleg, which is I'm so glad that that exists, but
Right.
it's not the same as being in the room and and seeing it happen in person. And so yeah, one of the things that I want to encourage through my work is people trying to not feeling that they can't go and see things that are from other cultures, but also I think having
Right.
respect for the cultures that are being represented as well. We're not going there to critique, we're going
Right.
there we're there as a guest, I think, and that's really important. And yeah, yeah. So when you think about gain, it's it does affect everybody. It does improve everybody's understanding of each other and of life, I think.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and one of the things I love about your performance, particularly thinking about your performance of one of Angelica's songs from Hamilton,
Yes. Satisfied. Yes.
Satisfied, is that it's not there is a deaf angle to it, but there's also a queer angle to it as well, because you're taking you're playing all the characters, and
Yes.
um and it's very clear that you connect so strongly with the female characters there as well.
Yeah.
And so I would say, and I think this is something I'm going to write about in the book, because I want to write about the intersection between deaf gain and queer gain. And I think that
Hmm.
performance has both of those things there. There's things that are gained from you being a deaf performer, and there are things that are gained from being a queer performer. I don't know if you
Hmm.
can talk a little bit about how you kind of embody those characters when you're signing or when you're interpreting those songs.
Well, I always answer your questions a little roundabout, but thank you for
That's
your
okay.
patience.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a book that I recently read. It's called What About Men?
Okay.
Do you know this one?
No.
It is called what? Let me look up who wrote it. What About Men by Caitlin Moran.
Okay, yes. No, I
She,
know about Caitlin Moran. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, she is a feminist. Just for
Mm,
everyone else, she's like a strong feminist who talks about female rights and talks about
mm,
how the female psyche works, and she just keeps uniting women in that cause. And in her process, people kept coming up and being like, "But what about my son? What about my husband?"
mm,
And she's like, "That's not our problem." And so she ends up going on this deep dive of like
mm,
what it means to be a man and like figuring out what men think and
mm,
basically taking her gain from being a feminist and her lens on that onto male culture. And
mm.
it was fascinating because I think she analyzed more straight men than gay men, but then
Yeah.
she does mention some of the gay men issues. And I
Mm,
found there was something very interesting there because as we discuss it with gender, we realize it's not all binary, but
mm,
we do have the vocabulary. So I might say things incorrectly and I don't intend to. It's just my understanding of how to express it. But it's
mm,
like I feel like gay men have been given the opportunity, and I can only speak for gay men, given the
mm,
opportunity to be different, which then allows us to question and reevaluate if we want to participate in
mm.
masculinity and what that
Yes.
means.
Mm,
And so I find that like I really enjoyed painting nails. I love that. I want to
mm,
have painted nails. So now I have to make the decision if I'm comfortable with that. And so as I've continued in Josh's journey of accepting the feminine side or whatever we deem as feminine, it's given me that space to really explore how I feel. And so I think what I found is that through listening and reading and digesting female characters, it helped me as a small town gay boy be okay with my femininity, be
yeah.
okay with my insecurity, be okay with the feelings because these characters were doing it. And so I always attributed that to like female characters helped me be okay with who I
Mm,
was. And so when it came to playing Angelica or playing Dawn in Waitress,
yeah.
it was it was finding that thing where I'm like, I relate in that feeling, but you're a
Mm,
woman. And then be like, but I have those feelings too. So like what happens if I lean into that? And then it comes up into this weird other character emerges, and
mm,
it's like, oh, the queer one. There's the woman version, there's the queer version.
yeah.
And I'm really curious what happens if a man, a straight man, would take that and go, oh, I relate to that in this way. And then a
Mm,
character would emerge. And so it's like, how do we give different hues and shades to these
yes.
characters with our own perspective?
Yeah, I love that you talked before about painting over. When you're acting, you talked about how you there are certain things that you have to paint over when you're acting over yourself. And I think we were talking specifically about when you have to play straight characters, and you talked about
Yes,
paint something over. And one of the things about playing gay characters is that you don't have to do that sort of painting. You know, you can
right.
let more of yourself out. And I
Yes.
found that a really interesting comment as well. And have you played more gay roles since we spoke last?
I don't think so. I
Ah,
don't think so. No. I've done Quasimodo. I've
mhm.
done Romeo. I've done Billy and Tribes. I've done Romeo 3 times, so that's
Yeah.
been different. But that's been interesting because my journey of playing Romeo has changed, and I've really
Mm,
started to evaluate like what is it that makes a straight actor look straight. And my secret tip that I have to share that I've been telling my queer friends is
mm,
it's awful. It's really awful. But when I tell my female friends who are in shows, I'm like, I'm gonna do this, and they're like, that is exactly right. When you walk in, the person that you are interested in, immediately look at their boobs. Don't look at everyone in the room. Just walk into the scene, and as soon as you see who your character's interested in, look at their boobs for the first 30 seconds, and then continue with the scene. And she's like, yes, yes. I'm sitting in a restaurant, and a guy walked in, clocked me, and looked at my boobs, and I'm like, and I like it, and it works.
mm,
Everyone, like even my mom, my boyfriend's mom was like, you seemed very straight. Like you kept that was on, and I told her, and she laughed, and she was like,
mm,
that, yeah. Yeah, she's like,
mm,
if you're not looking at my boobs, you're looking at my vagina. And like,
mm.
so I thought it was interesting that that was what I found with that
What do
process.
gay
But
men
I
look at then when they walk in and they meet a man?
I think it's close.
Mm,
The minute I
yeah,
walk in, my eyes immediately go to the coolest looking outfit. Like I
mm,
immediately gravitate to that. But I do know some gay men who walk in and immediately the hottest guy in the room is who they
yeah,
look at. And I'm like, okay, to each his own.
yeah, yeah.
What do you look
Interesting.
at when you walk in?
I would say, yeah, I would probably be guilty of that actually. I would say probably faces and eyes and
That makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Uh,
So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that
yeah,
that's a kind of thing that you can do and you can think, oh yeah, that's what, this is common to a lot of
right.
straight men or a lot of gay men or whatever it is. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really interesting. Um, yeah, so when I'm thinking about how things have changed over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, and thinking especially about the idea of queer gain, which you asked me the question, is there such thing as queer gain, and what would that
Is
look
there?
like? And so
And
with the book that I'm working on, I've been thinking about all of the experiences, the lived experiences that I think are common to queer people, not just queer men, but to queer people generally. And I had this, I think I've spoken about this in a podcast before, but I'll do it again just in case anyone didn't hear it. But I had this idea that people's sexuality is like people starting in the middle of a forest, So everyone
Ooh,
starts there, and you have to find your way out of the forest. That's what finding your sexuality is. But there's one path out of the forest that's already lit and has already been signposted, big neon signs, this way, and you can
yeah.
go down that pathway. And I think of that as being the straight pathway. So you go through that,
Okay.
and you have all these milestones through it. So you have your first kiss with somebody from the opposite sex. You
Right.
have your first relationship. You get married. You have children. You have grandchildren, and it leads you out of the forest. And it's a safe route, and there's nothing wrong with that route. A lot of people use it, but that's the straight route out. But if you're a queer person and you look down that road and you think that's not where I want to go, you have to find a different way out of the forest to come out somewhere different.
Yeah.
And so when you're doing that, you have to explore new pathways and pathways that maybe haven't been trodden very much before. And I always think of it in terms of as well that often these pathways, people have put barriers against them or, barbed
Hmm.
wire up to stop people going those ways because those ways aren't safe. And so being
Right.
queer means you have to explore these new pathways. Um, and I suppose when you become an older queer person, it's also about trying to find ways to mark those pathways for other people that want to follow them, which is what
Right.
representation is really. And so what
Yes.
I've been trying to think about is what some of those queer pathways look like and what some of those experiences are that are not the milestones on the straight path. And so I was thinking about the idea of not just coming out, but the idea of when you realize that you're queer, and then that kind of you have to hold on to that until you're ready to come out. And that's an
Right.
experience that I think that specific experience, nearly all queer people have that experience, but it is peculiar to queer people. And so that's
Hmm.
something that I would look at, how do we represent that? And I'm thinking also, I think we spoke about this a bit last time as well, but thinking about, relationships, do we have to have
Hmm.
a relationship that only has two people in it? Do we have to have
Mm.
a relationship that ends up in marriage? Do we have to have children? All of these things and finding different ways around that and finding ways to represent those things as well. Things like polyamory and promiscuity and all of those things which have been such a not just the queer experience, but have been ways that we've found to kind of reject those things. So that's kind of
Hmm.
where my thoughts on queer gain started, and now I'm
I
starting to
love
think, well,
that.
what do we gain from representing these experiences that are specific to queer people, if that makes sense.
I love that analogy. I love the idea of representation being like markings on a tree because it
Mm.
is. You have this giant neon sign in the forest that you're supposed to go there, but
Yeah.
you're like, that's not for me, but
Mm.
it's the only thing lit up. And so putting these little lights on the trees that
Yeah.
I can then follow, I love that analogy. And
Mm.
I think for me, it's funny because you had that conclusion and I've had a similar conclusion where I feel like if I boil down deafness to one perspective, I would say it's communication.
Mm.
We love to communicate. We love to communicate about communicating and communicating about how you're not communicating to communicate about the idea of communicating. It's just like we're just constantly
I
doing
love
that.
it.
And I feel like with queer experiences, it's consent.
Mm.
It's always about consent for us.
Yes.
Consent to our kinks, consent to our dressing, consent to lingo play, consent to gender expression, consent.
Mm.
We're constantly talking about consent and how do we create a safe space for each other. So for our cross-dressing, I don't know the right word, but
Mm.
like people who want to dress in the different gender, but still still
Yeah.
identify as, a man wearing a dress or a woman wearing man's clothing.
Mm.
Like, how do we create a space where that is allowed and consented? And so I feel like that
Mm.
is what we bring to the world as queer people is consent.
Yes, I think you're right, actually. I think that's absolutely right. And that whole idea of am I allowed to? And which is a
Yeah.
question that in this context, in the context of gender and sexuality, is a question that straight people have to ask less, I think. Um,
Yes.
yeah, and I think even moving on that, things like "Will you still love me if?" or those sort
Right.
of questions are really fundamental to a lot of us, and because and I think perhaps to anybody that has to find a different path for whatever reason, but I think in especially for those of us that are queer. But that's how we get all of our really interesting stories. And we talked a bit earlier about
Hmm.
how queer representation is starting to change. I love that. Am
Yeah.
I allowed to make Cats into a ballroom show, Andrew Lloyd Webber? And for once, thank goodness he said yes. I mean, it's only very
Thank
recent that
goodness.
we've let people do that, him and Cameron McIntosh. But I'm
Oh
glad that,
yeah.
and then look what it becomes. It becomes this, huge outpouring for a community that has only recently been represented,
Yep.
in the
Yes.
mainstream. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I
It
think,
also makes you think about Company. They switched to a woman lead, and then I mean, freaking love Marianne Elliott. I think she's
yeah,
brilliant, and like, if she's listening, please let's make art together. I'm obsessed with her. But like that split of Bobby being a woman and then adding a gay couple in the Not Get Married Today, I
yes,
thought was a great. It was exactly what I like to do with my work, and I saw her doing it with that, and I was like, I love this. I do think it wasn't finished. I can
yes.
admit that it wasn't finished. There were pieces you were like, what's it's Alice in Wonderland? No, it's not. Okay, now we're doing this again. No, it's not. Okay, the floor stopped moving. Okay, what's I
Mm,
don't, but I loved it. And I thought like Ballroom Cats, the female company, and then
mm.
there was also apparently an all gay company at a roundabout with Michael
Oh,
Arden and then
okay.
Morale and everything. And
Yeah.
Stephen Sondheim was like, I think we're gonna just, not do that. And so I'm like,
Yes, that's
okay, cool.
right.
Yeah.
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 That company was interesting because the other thing I was speaking about, I speak about this less now. I think perhaps because we've moved further with representation, but I sometimes
Mm-hmm.
talk about some productions being stepping stones. So with company,
Mm.
I really felt that. I thought it was such a brave step to take. And then I thought, oh wow, you've done this now, and we've changed some genders, and we've got a gay male couple. Now, what happens if you make Bobby bisexual and you have instead of those three men, you have two men and a woman, or a non-binary
Right.
person? Then what
Right.
happens? And so,
Right.
and it was not really up to Marianne Elliott to do that, to push it that far. I mean, it would have been great if she had, but
Right.
her work on this production hopefully opens the way to think of other ways to represent things differently. And I love that. I think as sometimes as a queer community, we can be quite sort of disparaging of things that don't go far enough. But I think when we
Mm.
start to think, okay, that's a stepping stone, that's great. Now
Yeah.
I think that's a much maybe a much more healthy way to approach um productions without putting too much burden on each individual production to do absolutely
Yeah.
everything at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's hard because I think one of the things that when I did Hunchback happened
Mm,
was the deaf plus community. So there's a term called deaf plus, which means like deaf plus cerebral palsy, deaf plus blind, deaf
mm,
plus. So that's a term that encompasses that entire community.
yeah.
They approached me and said that they're going to protest the production I was in.
Right.
And I was like, oh, and I don't know if I spoke about this, but it was like, they were like, we think it's bad that you, as a disabled person, know better and you still took this job. Because Quasimodo is a disabled person with
Mm,
physical deformity, and you are pretending to have these physical deformities. And I was like, okay, I'm with you. Do you mind getting me a picket sign to join you when you protest all the other productions with able-bodied cis straight men playing it? Maybe
mm,
some queer, but not a single disability in sight. And they then came back to me like, you know what? You're right. And I was
mm,
like, it's the door. The door closes on us all the time. And we sabotage ourselves because we go, oh, I know that person. They should know better. Let's protest them. I'm like,
mm.
but no, here's the thing. This is a stepping stone to a greater thing. And so
Yeah.
now theater productions all over the country are happening with deaf artists playing Quasimodo.
Yeah.
And that is the stepping stone. So now the next conversation is like, I had a conversation with a producer who was like, let's do Hunchback again. I was like, great. And they're like, we want you to play Hunchback. And I said, I have a different idea for you. What if
Mm,
I direct it and I play it on Friday and Saturday afternoon, but Saturday night and Sunday matinee is an actual actor with cerebral palsy?
mm.
And they're like, oh, but we don't have anyone who's big enough for that. I said, I know you can still sell tickets to me and it, fine. But we
Yeah.
have a certain other days that allows the audience to go. And they said, yes, and then the pandemic happened. But that was something that I found
Mm,
interesting was producers like, we don't know anyone in this community. We're scared to take that risk. And it's like, right. But if I did not have that production, we wouldn't be able to have this
yes.
push. So I
Mm.
agree with that. It's
Yeah.
like small changes.
I think that's really important. I think making space is really important as well. And
Yes.
you know, um, and being aware of um these intersections and because actually that may not have been a thing I'd even considered about Quasimodo. And now that you've said it, I think, well, of course, that makes perfect sense. Um,
Right.
but yeah, it is really important to keep having these conversations, but also
Hmm.
to celebrate things that maybe don't go as far as we would like, but at least are starting to answer a question and are providing the next step in a
Mm.
journey. I think that's really important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm. I was going to ask you a little bit
I'm
about. Oh, so go on, Josh.
well, no, as I was like, talking about that next step in the journey is there's now a production of American Idiot happening with Jeff West in LA.
Oh, amazing.
And I have spoken with the director because I interviewed for the assistant directing position, but I
Mm.
didn't get it. My friend did, and she's lovely. She's amazing. I'm
Yeah.
so excited she has it. But one of the things he talked about is he was like, I wonder where is the space for Black and brown artists and deaf within this story of American Idiot?
Mm.
Because I feel like there's so much in this that resonates with us. And I was like, right, this totally makes sense. A white man singing about his frustrations with his country after post 9/11
Mm.
was relevant and valid and real. And then now what happens when you put that on a person of color in 2024
Yeah.
who's frustrated with their country post all the things that are happening.
Mm.
And so I thought I'm really excited about that. And I'm really
Yeah.
excited to see what they have to bring to this piece
Mm.
that we know from the early 2000s into the modern world.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's really important. And actually that starts to answer my next question as well, which is thinking about, have there been things over the last few years where you think you felt represented as a
Mm.
queer person, as a deaf person, as both? What sort of things have happened since we last spoke that you've really enjoyed?
Oh, I want to hear what you have to say about this as well, because I'm
Yeah.
so curious. I loved Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
That spoke to me on a level that was so profound because of Stephanie Shu's character.
Mm.
The fact that she kept changing clothes and changing appearances and being fluid, I loved. I
Yeah.
absolutely loved, because I told my mom, I was like, you have to watch this. And then she finished. My mom was like, I don't understand it. I was like, I know what it is. It's you. It's your story. And she's like, what do you
Mm.
mean? I was like, it's a mom who doesn't know what to do with their queer kid. Because they're
Mm.
like, everything that I perceive as a woman is being challenged and is challenging myself. And so I love that she, like, at one point is like swinging and then it's dildos in her hand. And it was like, because every time I would talk to my mom about something, she immediately would go into the sexual aspect. And I
Mm.
wasn't even talking about it. I was like, no, that's not, but she sees me as this flamboyant sexual person, but it's not.
Mm.
And when you watch the movie at the beginning, Stephanie Shu was literally just this like slightly granola girl who's
Mm.
like kind of like she's lesbian, but she's also not really that flamboyant.
Mm.
But her mom perceives her as this like
Yes.
flamboyant, crazy, and I loved it. Like if
Mm.
that spoke to a huge part of me, in my experience. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I'm trying to think. I suppose, I mean, there's so many musicals that I'm writing about that I've loved and that I see different things in. Especially there's a musical in development called XY,
Ooh,
which is about an intersex
okay.
person who is an adult looking back at themselves as a child and kind of trying to come to terms with their childhood so they can move on with their adult relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful piece. I mean, I've interviewed Oliver Hauser, who wrote it just last week for a podcast episode. But there's so much that, and the music is beautiful. But yeah, there has been so many different productions recently. Um, Funny enough, there's not loads on at the moment on Broadway or on the West End, but I think I've learned that that not the best, that's not the word I want to use, but my favorite queer productions are the ones that happen off Broadway, off West
Oh
End,
yeah.
regionally, that kind of thing. And hopefully that's what the book will be able to kind of uncover as well. And I'm really kind of keen to try and get people to um put things up on the internet, on YouTube, on
Mm-hmm.
SoundCloud, Vimeo, whatever it is, so that people can experience, even if your musical's only had two performances somewhere, put something up so people can experience it and get talking about it. And you
Yeah.
never know when the right time is going to be for these stories, I
Yeah.
think.
I
But
really
yeah,
hope
so
we
many
get
things.
I hope we get our act together here because I feel like the National Theater has just been doing great at like posting
Mm.
and sharing and streaming. I'm like,
Yes.
we need to get up on this. And it's
Mm.
it's funny you said that because it made me also realize, right, we in Chicago, we have the premiere of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil with Taylor Mack as the
Oh,
book
okay. Yeah.
and Jason Robert Brown. And so that's a queer story.
Mm.
And so I'm gonna go see it and I'm curious about
Ooh.
what ideas they're gonna play with, you know?
Yes. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think I'd even heard about that. I mean, this is
Mm.
the thing is it's so difficult sometimes to keep track.
Track.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the things I'm really hoping to do. I mean, this is depends. I mean, I think I can say this on the podcast now because it will have happened by the time it's released. But I'm now redundant. My job at the university I've been working with for the last 10 years ends on the end at the end of August. So
Okay.
don't know what's happening next yet. So from the beginning of September, I'm unemployed. Ah.
Ah!
Which is which is very scary for me, but actually quite normal for most of the people I talk to, because most actors have these sort of periods there. But one of the things I really want to do is to set up a queer musical theatre network,
I
where
love that.
people can talk from across, internationally, and we can support new work. We can support safety for queer performers and queer creatives in the industry. Um, just for something where if something is going on, and a queer show is going on somewhere, we all know about it really, really quickly, and we can find ways to try and archive it so that other people can see it. I mean, I'm thinking especially things for intersex people or trans people. I think bisexual people as well. There's just such a little representation of bisexual people. And then all of the intersections with deaf people, disabled people, people of color, all of those different things there. I think it would be really great to find a way to sort of centralize what's going on so that so everyone that needs to see themselves is able to see themselves.
I
I think
agree.
that's what I really want to try and do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea.
Mm.
I think it would be very helpful. And I think that it also is like I think it's inspiring when you see other creatives given the
Mm.
opportunity, then it makes you like so much. I
Yeah.
feel like I'm writing plays or I'm pitching ideas, and it gets to a point where I'm kind of like, am I just throwing myself against the wall here? Like,
Mm.
is this actually gonna go anywhere? And then it's like we connect with other artists like yourself, and it's like, oh wait, we are right. We are
Yeah.
watching each other, we are elevating each other, and I
Mm.
think that's such a smart move. Yeah.
Mm. I wish that I was better with social media because I think I've seen all of these things and I struggle to tell people about them because it's just not something that I really understand how to do. And
Mm.
I've also one of the other things that I've discovered over the past few years is that we think it's quite likely that I'm dyspraxic, which is kind of a visual it's a visual condition, which means that I find it very difficult to understand things like distance and depth. I find it very difficult to draw or to copy things because I can't get the dimensions right. I'm very
Ah,
clumsy. I fall over things all the time because I can't judge distance, and
right.
it's one of the things that I've only really talked about very, very recently. But what that does is it makes me realize, there are certain skills that actually I need help with, that I need people,
Mm-hmm.
I need to be part of a team when I'm working on these projects because I'm just not the sort of person that can do the visual stuff or the
Mm.
advertising or taking photographs. I'm just awful. Because I just cannot quite get it into frame. And also following maps is hilarious because I look at it and I try and turn myself, and then the Google map turns with me, and I can't work out which way's which.
Right, right. Yeah,
Mm.
yes.
Yeah, so
So the next question to you is, what is this Praxic gain?
That's the next question. I love that. I love that, Josh. Thank you. I think actually we're probably at a good point there to pretty much round things off.
Okay.
I don't know if there's anything else that you particularly want to talk about publicly, or anything
Mm.
that you've noticed about representation, over the last few years, or anything like that, or any advice to people.
Oh, wow. I just love these conversations. I think the more we
Mm.
have these conversations, the more we can analyze things. I think if I had to say anything, I think it's like allowing we have a couple of choices as a community here
Mm.
in creating work. I think we have the choice of revisiting classics through a
Mm.
different lens and allowing people who are creative from that community to take their fingers and work their way into this piece.
Mm.
Or we can start supporting, I think, and
Yes.
we support work from those creatives. And I think the thing that I keep reminding people around me is like, right, we've had 300-400 years for theater to be developed in the way it is now. How long have we given deaf people the space to create their work and to
Mm.
fail and to figure it out?
Yeah.
It cannot keep being I'm putting my $200,000 in this, and if it fails, then deaf theater is over. We cannot have
Mhm.
that. We
No.
cannot have that. That stifles creation, and I think that we're seeing a lot of um, political movement and stuff to combat that. And I think we have to be vigilant as a community in
Mm.
saying that we do need the money. It's not a luxury to fund projects. It is a necessity because this is
Yes.
what leads us to where we are. Innovation requires so much investment and so much groundwork to get there.
Mm.
And so I think that if you're somebody who is not feeling like you are intersectional enough or not, I'm not a minority enough. I don't think you have to be. I think just joining forces with a friend or a creative that you enjoy and be like,
Mm.
I have skills that I love to share. I have insights that I love to share and working with people because I find myself being given opportunities, which I'm very thankful for, but also finding myself kind of like drowning in the just this work. And then I get really worked up about, am I wasting the people around me's time? Am I wasting their resources because I don't have guidance all the time? And so I've learned to be more vocal and like I can write stories, I can tell stories, but I
Mm.
need support and like someone who's done this before. And
Yes.
so finding people to just be like, oh, I was there once and be like, yeah, thank you. And so how do we do
Mm.
this? And just having the conversation. That was something I wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank you so much, Josh. It's been lovely to talk to you again. And thank you,
been
everybody, for
lovely.
watching. And hopefully, I will speak to you again at some stage soon.
I would
Bye.
love that. Yes. Bye.